Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Dill. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State and director of TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at PSU. So welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar, our first public seminar of the fall term. And we're really excited. I'm going to be doing some introductory stuff, and then we're just going to launch into today's exciting talk. So our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition at Portland State since the year 2000. Normally, we hold the seminars live on PSU's urban campus in downtown Portland, in addition to webcasting. And of course, due to COVID-19, this term's seminars are all completely online. And the other thing that I wanted to share is that this fall, our lineup is going to be focusing on equity in transportation, both recent research and practice. We're very excited about the lineup of speakers that we have for this term. I will also, I know we have a lot of perhaps new people who have not participated in the seminar before. I just want to explain that during the fall term, we offer the seminar as a one-credit class for Portland State University students in both civil engineering and urban studies and planning. Plus, we have a great public audience from around the country and beyond. So welcome, everyone. Okay, there we go. So we're very excited today to have Professor Jesus Barajas present on Biking While Black, how planning contributes to unjust policing. Dr. Barajas is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy, and he's also affiliated faculty with the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. He was also previously at the University of Illinois. So we're very excited to have him here today. Before we jump into his presentation and I turn things over to him, I do want to let you know about a couple upcoming seminars. Next week, we have Caro Vera from Fair and Peers, who's going to be talking about dignity-infused community engagement for Vision Zero in Los Angeles. So we're excited about her talk. And following that, we're going to have Margot Hill from Eastern Washington University, who will be talking about tribal mobility, accessibility, and social equity. So I'm going to do some logistics here, and I also realized that I neglected to introduce my co-instructor for the term, Professor Chris Monsieur from Civil Engineering, who is there. So I know a lot of you have been using Zoom for the past 6 months of your life, and perhaps you haven't used GoToWebinar before, or you're a bit rusty at it. So just I'll highlight a few key things here. So Jesus is going to present for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we're going to do Q&A at the end of that period. To ask a question, we are using the questions pane in your control panel. So you need to type out the question, the control, and you can ask the questions at any time, but we're going to do the answering all at the end. I want to remind the PSU students who are enrolled in this for a class to indicate that in your display name, because we will be giving priority to the enrolled students in terms of answering questions. And if we run out of time for everyone's questions, I know we have a pretty big attendance list, we'll see if we'll give Jesus an opportunity to email any responses We are going to be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later, so you can watch it again or share it with other people. And you'll also receive the video recording and the presentation slides in an email following today's seminar in the next day or two. If you are tracking professional development hours, it's eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. And I believe I covered everything. If I didn't, I'm hoping Chris or Teresa will chime in. But with that, I am going to hand it over to Jesus Barajas.
All right. Thank you, Professor Dill. Thank you, Professor Monsieur. I appreciate the invitation to come here today. Let's see. I'm not seeing the control window, so there we go. All right, is the presentation coming through? Yep, okay, great. So thanks again for the invitation to speak with you today. I am pleased to present work that comes from a collaboration between, sorry, I'm just getting some windows out of the way here. All right, I'm pleased to present research today that comes from a collaboration between nonprofits and academia that focuses on multiple facets of examining mobility justice in the city of Chicago. So this work really was sort of instigated by Obai Reed, who's president and CEO at Equiticity, which is an organization in Chicago really focused on improving mobility justice for Black and brown communities in the city. And he sort of put out some feelers a few years ago to find researchers who are interested in helping him make a case to the city that, you know, transportation planning has failed these communities, and the city really needs to step up and address justice in the way that it does things in terms of investment and programming. So a few pieces of this work have been with Kate Lowe at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where we've looked at sort of barriers to workforce development with respect to transportation, and Audrey Wenink and her colleagues at the Metropolitan Planning Council, where we've looked at equity metrics in decision-making in regional planning. But today I'm here to talk about the connection between policing and planning. So I'll start by talking about the background and then thinking about how the umbrella of safety links planning and policing, then get into the study, talk about what I see are the main takeaways, and then invite questions and discussion at the end. So this presentation is not about police violence per se, but I wanted to put in perspective some of the consequences about what I'm talking about. On August 31st of this year, Dijon Kazi was killed by sheriff's deputies who stopped the 29-year-old Black man for code violations, which we later learned were biking on the wrong side of the road and splitting traffic while he was on his bike. He was shot 19 times and later died after those gunshots. Representative Karen Bass, the congressperson who represents Central LA, put out the question, what bike violation is so severe that they needed to stop him? What bike violation was so severe that they needed to chase him? What bike violation was so severe that they needed to shoot him as many times as they did? In 2018, Vallejo, California police shot and killed Ronell Foster after he was stopped for riding a bike in an unsafe manner. In 2017, Salt Lake City police killed Patrick Harmon after he was stopped for riding a bicycle without lights. Palm Beach, Florida sheriff's deputy shot and paralyzed Dontrell Stevens in 2013 after stopping him on his bicycle, mistaking his cell phone for a gun. And these are just the events that made the headlines, and these are just the ones focused on cycling. And we know that violence in Black communities at the hands of the police has been at the center of our consciousness this summer and into this fall. And it really brings to light sort of what the connections, what the consequences of a failure to plan around cycling specifically can be in Black communities. So let me talk first about safety as a planning objective. And we're sort of in the middle of a crisis when it comes to active travel safety these days. Both pedestrian and bicycle fatalities have increased steadily over the last decade or so. And you can see here on the chart that bicycle fatalities have increased 38% over the last decade. From 623 in 2010 to 857 in 2018, which is the most recent year that we have data. And they've increased not only in raw numbers, but also as a proportion of all fatalities on the roadways. The pedestrian side mirrors this too, and Angie Schmidt's new book, Right of Way, addresses some of the causes or likely causes for this on the pedestrian side, putting the blame on the prevalence of large vehicles like SUVs and pickup trucks, on distracted driving, and on bad pedestrian design. And it's likely that many of these same factors are in play for cyclists as well, in terms of what's causing these increases in fatalities. When we dig a little bit deeper into the patterns, into the statistics of bicycle fatalities, we find evidence of disparities by race and ethnicity in terms of who's being killed. In aggregate, over the last decade, Black cyclists have made up about 13% of all fatalities, Latinos 16%, white cyclists 58%, and then lower percentages for Asian, Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans. But Black people make up a lower share of the population relative to their fatality rate, and take a smaller share of their trips, a smaller number of miles of their trips by bicycle, and a smaller proportion of their trips by bicycle too. So clearly there are inequities in safety that need to be addressed. And as I'm sure you'll learn about more next week in the webinar around Vision Zero, many cities in the United States have taken Vision Zero as their strategy to address some of these safety issues, both sort of broadly and then examining closer at the disparities. Just very quickly, Vision Zero developed in Sweden in the mid-1990s, now adopted by at least 44 cities in the United States and many more around the world. And underlying Vision Zero are the principles that people are prone to error on the streets, and that the road system should be designed to acknowledge that fallibility and forgive those mistakes so that people aren't dying when people make mistakes. So the ultimate goal is to eliminate traffic fatalities and serious injuries through a data-driven approach and a multifaceted effort that generally focuses on engineering to deliver and improve infrastructure, education to inform road users about safe behavior, and enforcement of the most dangerous traffic offenses. The data-driven approaches to safety have revealed stark disparities in who is most vulnerable and where. In San Francisco, which I'm not showing on this slide, 31% of city streets are located in communities of concern that are neighborhoods with high concentrations of low-income residents, immigrants, and seniors. But half of the streets with the highest number of traffic injuries are located in those same communities. Similar patterns are evident in other large cities like Los Angeles. Here on the slide on the left is Portland, and you see how the sites for high crashes and the corridors, the streets for high crashes intersect with the communities of concern in in that city. And in Chicago, the story is much the same here. Circled on the right are low-income communities and communities of color, and many of the high crash corridors and areas are in those locations too. In Chicago, which is the city I'm going to be talking about in a little bit more detail today, the Vision Zero action plan first came out in 2017, where the city identified those high crash corridors and neighborhoods that I showed you on the previous slide. And their emphasis is on those three pillars of engineering, education, and enforcement. I've underlined here a section from the citywide policies and goals around enforcement, and their policy is to police traffic laws fairly, focusing on education and dangerous driving behaviors that cause the most severe crashes. So in other words, they see police engagement as a core part of changing the culture of safety in the city. But there are advocacy groups, including Equiticity, who's been a partner in this research, that are working to remove this language from the policy because of the discriminatory effects of policing. And I think their advocacy is having some play finally at the city with a change in mayoral administration, a new transportation commissioner who is really open to and sincere about engaging with issues of equity and justice. Other cities have acknowledged the racial bias in policing, but haven't necessarily removed enforcement from their programs either. The Vision Zero network itself has acknowledged the problematic use of enforcement, but if you speak with advocates, many of them will say that they don't necessarily see these acknowledgements as going far enough to addressing the problem. So what I'm interested in understanding is to what extent that these issues are connected, what extent that over-policing in communities of color is driven by failures of planning and urban investment. And I'm using cycling as the case study to investigate that. So what do we know about cycling enforcement? Well, let me start with the behavioral side. So most bicycle citations are given for riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. In 2009 and 2010, cycling on the sidewalk was the third most common summons issued in New York City. The first two were consumption of alcohol on the street and disorderly conduct. In Chicago, over the time period that I'm looking at, 90% of the bicycle citations were given for riding on the sidewalk. Well, why would that be? We know from work that Professor Dill has done and many others have done that cyclists prefer off-street separated infrastructure. The more separation from traffic, the more they prefer it. But cyclists will ride on sidewalks along high traffic roads if they don't have other infrastructure to use. We know that sidewalk riders are generally more timid and less experienced. And so again, they're looking for maximum separation between them and moving traffic. But people will ride in high traffic places. Why don't they just go on the side streets? Cyclists will ride on high traffic places, especially where crime is a concern and they need those eyes on the street to help them feel safe. We also know that everyone in traffic, no matter the mode of transportation, has broken a traffic rule. Surveys indicate something between 96 to 99% have indicated that they have not followed the traffic laws to a T at some point in their lives. These surveys also, when we look at cyclists specifically, a large-scale global survey of about 18,000 cyclists, 71% of them say that they break rules for personal safety reasons, and that's the most common reason given. A smaller study in Montreal gave cyclists some hypothetical scenarios to see when they would choose to break a traffic rule, and generally they broke the rules when they felt it was safer than precisely following the vehicle code. So what I say is that these quote unquote illegal behaviors are really rational responses to deficiencies in infrastructure and planning. When we look specifically at some of the issues that Black cyclists face, we can find other barriers to cycling. And some of these are related to personal safety and security. As I mentioned before, in sort of riding on the high traffic streets, there's been multiple studies with Black participants. Charles Brown in particular from Rutgers University finds that not feeling safe from crime is a common barrier to cycling among Black cyclists. In Boston, a study found that cyclists from low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, again, preferred cycling on highly visible streets over separated infrastructure on quieter streets because of that desire to be protected from crime. And a third barrier that we can point to is around police profiling. Again, in this New Jersey study, was another common barrier for Black and Latino cyclists. And if you look at research and media reports from around the country, Detroit, Tampa, Chicago, specifically cities that I've looked at, all have documented instances of disproportionate policing against Black cyclists. So then a question arises as whether policing is the right intervention to improve safety. And if we look at sidewalk cycling, well, maybe we should be policing cyclists on the sidewalk. Sidewalk cycling does seem to be riskier. A meta review of 23 studies estimated that the risk of collisions while riding on the sidewalk is somewhere around 2 to 16 times of that riding on the road. Although that varies by the type of infrastructure, again, that's available on the road. So higher incidence rate of collisions, falls, and injuries on sidewalks compared to other infrastructure. But people don't translate those statistics into their perceptions. And there's a very sort of polar view about the safety of sidewalks. In one study in Vancouver, Canada, about 40% of cyclists thought that sidewalk riding was somewhat or very dangerous, and about 50% thought it was safe or very safe. So again, those experiences of cyclists play a role in there as well. But the problem with policing is the disparities, the injustice, the racism that comes along with it. And I'll focus just on the traffic stops here. And it's important because traffic stops are the most common form of interaction between police and the public. And as we look at the data, we find persistent disparities in stops, tickets, and arrests for Black people compared to other groups. So this is looking at all traffic stops and all traffic policing. And we have studies that show, one that looked at data from 20 million traffic stops over 18 years in North Carolina, found evidence for pervasive racial disparities across departments of all sizes, and many times because traffic stops are used and have been used as a strategy of targeting policing in communities of color. Another large study out of Stanford examined 100 million traffic stops across 50 municipal and state police departments. Black drivers are stopped more often per capita than white drivers. And when the researchers adjusted for the time of the day, and so looked at night time, the rates of issuing tickets during the night when the police officer cannot visibly see skin tone, they found that Black drivers made up a smaller share of the total number of drivers stopped at night, which points to racial profiling as the culprit. The Chicago Police Department has issued a disproportionate number of bicycle tickets in majority Black and Latino neighborhoods, which they have on record the police chief saying that it was justified as part of their violence reduction strategies. And I can go on and on. The main takeaway here, though, is that when we examine traffic enforcement responses to injury incidents or obvious safety violations, researchers actually found little evidence of racial disparities with respect to traffic enforcement. But when they looked at discretionary stops, that is, pulling people over because the light is out or issuing a bicycle ticket, that's when the disparities were more evident. So let me talk about the work that I did here today. And what I wanted to know to answer the research goal was what influenced the number of bicycle tickets issued per street segment in the city of Chicago, accounting for all of the characteristics of the street and the composition and context of the neighborhood. So with my collaborators, I issued a Freedom of Information Act request to the Chicago Police Department, in which we obtained all of the bicycle tickets issued between January of 2014 and December of 2019. When I talk about the data in this presentation, I'm going to focus only on sidewalk riding tickets, again, because that was 90% of the tickets issued. And those tickets can be linked directly to questions about planning outcomes in terms of street characteristics and bicycle facilities. The data that came from the Chicago Police Department, for those of you who work with messy data, this is a great example of messy data, and data that we wish that we had more information included. The geographic information was specific to the street block, so I didn't get XY coordinates, and we had to match those to the street segments. And we did that all right. We got a 97% match rate, so we got most of the tickets to the street network. The ticket information included data about location by block face and the type of infraction, but nothing else. There was no information about personal characteristics of the person being cited, whether it was gender, race, age, none of that, which the department claimed that they did not collect. And so I can't say anything about who exactly was stopped, only where they were stopped. I have data about the street segment characteristics, and specifically what type and whether there was bicycle infrastructure on the street segment, and the functional class of the street. So whether it was an arterial road, whether it was a collector street, whether it was a local street. We got rid of all the expressways because there are no sidewalk tickets on expressways. I would have loved to have had traffic volume, which would have been a better representation of the danger that cyclists face, but there's no data set, no open data set available in the city that provided that information. The other information is measured at the neighborhood level, the census tract level, really. And so I have data about neighborhood demographics, about density, and also about safety and police presence. So how many officers are assigned on average to the precinct that the census census tract is in, and data about safety in terms of the number of serious and fatal bicycle crashes and the number of fatal and serious vehicle crashes. To give you a sense of the numbers, the number of sidewalk citations issued have been declining over the last few years. 2014, we saw almost 4,000 tickets issued for riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. In 2019, that was down to 1,343. But again, when you sort of dive deep into the patterns, the Chicago Tribune had a series of studies 3 years in a row that showed where these tickets were issued. And again, 58% of these tickets were issued in majority Black and brown neighborhoods in a city that is, majority Black neighborhoods in a city that is only 1/3 Black. This is an sort of a legacy of the long struggle that the people of Chicago have had with the Chicago Police Department and their discriminatory policing practices. There is currently a torture commission that the state of Illinois set up that found that 125 African Americans were tortured by police in the 70s and 80s, and 400 cases are right now before that commission pending investigation. In looking at how the Chicago Police Department uses stop and frisk practices, or where they stop individuals who they have a reasonable suspicion of carrying weapons or having committed a crime, the American Civil Liberties Union found that the Chicago Police Department stopped 9 out of every 100 people, which was a rate 4 times higher than New York City, which is well known for its bad stop and frisk practices. And 3/4 of those stopped in Chicago were Black. And so that led to a negotiated agreement between the ACLU and the Chicago Police Department, in which the department would collect and report more data and more transparently. And that agreement went into effect in 2017. So for that reason, what I'm talking about here is going to focus on 2017 to 2019, because there's perhaps those change in practices made a difference in terms of discriminatory policing. Not presenting today, but I found that actually they didn't, the patterns remain the same. And because we have a little bit better data from 2017 to 2019. So we're only focused on these about 6,000 tickets issued between 2017 and 2019. So for those of you who do not know Chicago very well or at all, the map on the left gives you a sense of the racial composition of the city and the size of the city. So in that upper left corner, the little sort of square oval bit that hangs off the city, that's O'Hare Airport. So there's no population there. The city has roughly 2.7 million people. As I mentioned, the city is roughly 1/3 African American, roughly 1/3 white, and roughly 1/3 Latino. Although there's been an exodus of the Black population of late. Chicago is a starkly segregated city, which you can see by the relatively low amount of intermixing of colors on the map. Depending on how you count, it's ranked maybe 5th in the nation in terms of segregation indices. Infrastructure, just showing bikeways here on the right, but infrastructure is also inequitably distributed, where Black people make up a majority or a plurality of the population in a census tract. 11 to 12% of their street lengths are arterial roads, so the highest volume, widest roads, compared to 9% for majority white tracts. 6 to 9% of their street lengths have any sort of bicycle infrastructure at all, compared to 9 to 12% for majority white census tracts. On the right here, showing where bicycle injury crashes are concentrated. So they're generally concentrated in that black purple area in kind of the upper center, right center of the map. That's the Milwaukee Avenue corridor, which it has the highest volumes of cycling in the city and is also known as the hipster highway because of the neighborhoods that it passes through are some gentrifying neighborhoods, some of the most rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods in the city. But if you notice where the citations are issued, so I'm just going to go back for a moment, you can see again this dark purple area in the center right. Many more bicycle injury crashes to the north and kind of central around that, and then relatively few down in the southern part of the map. But if you notice where the citations are issued, so darker colors here indicate a higher per capita rate of tickets issued, you see the west side and the south side of the city are where many more of those tickets are issued. And if you translate it or overlay it with the map on the left, you can see that those are the majority Black and Latino neighborhoods in the city. So put it all together in a statistical model. I'm happy to talk about the model details later if you want, but I just want to kind of point to the main highlights from the results. And so first, just kind of looking at the demographics, these are really control variables and aren't sort of the causal influences of what I'm saying. But all of these charts are you can interpret them the same. You'll look for the dotted line at the 1.0 mark. If your dot and whiskers are to the right of that, it means that is associated with that variable is associated with a higher number of tickets issued on that street segment. And if it's to the left of that, it's a lower odds of getting citations on that street segment. So what we find of the 4 demographic characteristics at the top of this chart, we see poverty rates have the greatest association with the number of tickets issued per segment, followed by the Black and Latino population. We don't have the white population because of the way the modeling works. You need to leave one of those out. So you can sort of interpret the 3 racial categories as relative to the white population. So roughly for each percentage point greater the share of the Black or Latino population, there's about a 2% greater odds of getting a sidewalk riding ticket in that census along that segment. The density variables, we see more density translates to more activity and more exposure to police. And so as we might expect, the more stuff and people that are around, the more likely you are to get a ticket on those streets. But here's the interesting sort of the planning question here. So we'll look a little bit more closely at the infrastructure. So the top 2 lines are arterial streets and collector streets compared to local streets. And so if we again look at this comparison, your odds of getting a ticket for riding on the sidewalk were 15 times higher on arterial streets and 7 times higher on collector streets without bicycle infrastructure. So on arterial streets without bicycle infrastructure, on collectors without bicycle infrastructure, 15 and 7 times higher. When we look at the local streets, so these bike routes and bike lanes are looking at the effect on local streets with this type of infrastructure. We see more tickets on bike routes and bike lanes, probably because that's where people are riding more often. But let me point you to this set of characteristics here. So these are interaction variables in the model, or in other words, if we're looking at a type of street, what does it look like if we're looking also at the same time at the type of bicycle infrastructure available on the street? How does that influence the number of citations issued per that segment? And what we see in general, most of these are all of the point estimates are to the left of the 1.0 line, and most of them, the whiskers are too. So what that means is that in general, when these major street types, the arterials and the collectors, have bicycle infrastructure of any type, the lower the odds of getting a ticket are cut by 50 to 80% compared to if those streets did not have bicycle infrastructure. And then finally, looking at some of the neighborhood context variables, we actually see no association between serious bike crashes, which are fatalities, severe injuries, incapacitating injuries, anything that might have to send a bicyclist to the hospital. There was no association between the number of serious bike crashes in a neighborhood and the number of tickets issued on that segment. And we actually see there's a slightly negative association between serious crashes of all modes, which are really dominated by cars. A slight positive association with violent crimes per year which lends credibility to the claim that cycling tickets are not really associated with safety efforts. They're more likely to be associated with pretense for other types of infractions. And finally, there was no difference based on the number of officers assigned to the police district, whether there was more or less. It didn't have an effect on the number of tickets issued per segment. So kind of the top level takeaways here are really this study gives some new evidence about the ways that transportation planning is intertwined with unjust policing practices. I found that the majority Black and Latino neighborhoods were targets for policing, that bicycle infrastructure made a difference, especially particularly when it was located on major streets, but that infrastructure was disproportionately absent from neighborhoods of color, showing that greater risk of encounters with the police beyond just sort of the practices of the police are really tied to that question of infrastructure availability. And the bicycle citations were not associated with safety needs in higher crash areas, sort of underscoring the statements from the CPD itself that bicycle enforcement was instead tied to crime prevention strategies. So, okay, we have the evidence, and now what do we do? And I think the top level takeaway cannot be anything except we need to rethink the role of enforcement in traffic safety, and how planning is complicit, embedded, has a complicated relationship with policing and issues of race. We know from the history of urban planning that the history shows us that planning has had an active role in perpetuating racial disparities, racial inequities, redlining, single-family zoning excluded people of color from white neighborhoods. The development of freeways and railways divided and destroyed Black and brown communities. But a safety strategy like Vision Zero explicitly brings in policing and planning in ways that really haven't done so in the past. Previous strategies in which police enforcement was a central element of harm reduction in traffic safety, such as seatbelt enforcement, drunk driving campaigns, have largely not had a strong planning component. But of course, Vision Zero calls for, or has called for, traffic enforcement and planning and engineering to work side by side. So it's really incumbent upon all of those who are involved in these processes to examine what the unintended consequences are of this synergy, and recognize how planning has been complicit in this continuance of violence against Black communities. And it gives urgency to the need to repair this harm in meaningful ways. And so then, I would call upon planners to be aware of these histories when, advocating for this kind of strategy or what might come in the future that might look like a reasonable strategy to reduce traffic violence or, any sort of implementation. It calls for, investment in infrastructure and planning infrastructure in neighborhoods that don't have it, yes, but also working in close collaboration with communities there, especially around cycling. As those of you in Portland are well aware of, there's an optics of gentrification, and whether or not there is a tie in, objective data, those effects on Black communities are real in terms of the feeling of historic neglect, of wondering why now. Is this just a method to, push us out of our neighborhoods? this planning needs to be done together with the communities. And then finally, it pays attention, it is incumbent upon planners to pay attention to the intersections of identity and mobility. Identity matters. I talked about this in the background research. You know, who you are translates into the travel behavior, the route choice, the decisions that you make around cycling specifically, but in general. And so we have not always paid attention to those differences in the things that we're counting or the ways that we're going about planning. So, you know, I would really just call upon planners and policymakers to account for and understand those differing needs if we're thinking about bringing justice to the streets. And so I'll stop there, and I'll open it up now for questions and discussion.
Great, thank you so much. Normally we'd be in a room and we'd be giving you some applause, so I'm sure that the nearly 200 people online would be doing that virtually. So I'm going to do another quick reminder to the students who are enrolled in the seminar as a class. If you want to make sure that your question gets asked, put your class number in your name so it's displayed. So we had a few questions come in during your talk, and I'm going to maybe cover them a little chronologically. And so a few questions came up when you highlighted sort of the safety around sidewalk riding. Yeah. And so do you think that the higher rate of collisions for sidewalk riding, are these collisions with drivers as they come off the sidewalk? And this person, you know, hasn't seen much good data on cyclist pedestrian collisions. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about that, the safety issues with sidewalk riding?
Yeah, so I know, I mean, I'm trying to think back to the studies that I cited, and I think they were focused more on the interactions between vehicles and cyclists, and so sort of you know, crossing the parking garage exits or driveways, or kind of sort of right hooks when you're going sidewalk across an intersection, I think are the biggest safety issues. But I know I've seen a couple of studies that have looked at multi-use paths, and there tend to be more collisions on those, and those are generally restricted to cyclists and pedestrians, and so that's a danger as well.
Great. So a question, I guess, you know, I think from the engineering and planning, our assumption is that the traffic enforcement is really about safety. But yeah. Did you come across any, you know, other than what's the perspective of law enforcement, you know, other than their traffic division, regular officers might not have any knowledge or interest in traffic safety. So what's their perception about their enforcement activities?
I mean, so from everything that I can gather, the traffic enforcement, if we're thinking about traffic enforcement, there's two functions to it. And the first function is safety, you know, catching speeders, getting people who are blowing through stop signs, unsafe maneuvers. I don't know that translates to the cycling side as much as it does to the vehicle side. So that's one side, is safety for sure. But the second side is that it is an opportunity to find people who they might want to catch for other infractions. Drug infractions has been a big one historically, and they've used traffic stops as a pretense for finding drugs on people. If you look at sort of the way that police make traffic stops, you can find disparities in who is searched in those stops. So you might get two people pulled over for a broken taillight. The Black person is much more likely to be searched for things like drugs and weapons and so on, even though there's no difference in the rate of actually finding contraband. So there's those two sides to law enforcement in terms of transportation. We actually don't have good data about sort of what the effects are on cycling or pedestrians, other than you see a lot of pedestrian stops for stop and frisk for the same kinds of reasons. But a lot more of the evidence is on the vehicle side of things.
Great. So I don't know how long you've had some of these results out, if you've shared them with the city of Chicago yet, but are you seeing any changes that the city of Chicago is making in terms of their approach to Vision Zero that reflects any of this work?
Yeah, so I presented a preliminary version of these findings in March, right before the COVID shutdowns, and one of the members of the audience was the new transportation commissioner in Chicago. And we presented work not just on this, but also on looking at disparities in red light camera enforcement, which you would think automated enforcement should be fine with respect to equity and disparities, but you know, algorithmic bias exists, and the placement of the traffic cameras, the results were Black people were more likely to be caught in them and issued fines. But sort of going back to this, the commissioner saw this. We had a conversation with her and some of the research collaborators last month on some of these issues, and they are open, and they are now looking at sort of these interplays and trying to find a way to remove this element of enforcement from Vision Zero. It's a tricky problem because the police department carries a lot of weight in the city and has a lot of say, and so it's not going to be an easy, straightforward path to doing it. But they are the department is sort of thinking holistically, not just about the issue of police enforcement, but thinking holistically about the incidence of injustice and sort of racial disparities in the city, and how they can be a good actor in removing those barriers to opportunity for everyone. Really.
I think maybe there's another question here that I think is a good follow-on to that. Given these inequities in policing, should cities and states consider removing these discretionary laws, such as prohibiting sidewalk riding and mandatory helmet laws?
Oh, yeah, yes. I mean, it's just an opportunity for trouble. The sidewalk riding is a trickier element because we know that there are safety issues with that, especially in sort of dense areas with conflicts with pedestrians. The multi-use paths that I saw. The evidence points to mandatory helmet laws don't necessarily make cyclists safer. It actually decreases cycling, right? So especially when we're rethinking about the role of police in society and the issues with systemic racism and injustice, any opportunity to remove the potential for interaction, I think is one that we should really consider taking.
Great. I think there's a couple of questions along the same sort of thread. I mean, given that your work sort of uncovered the relationship between the benefit of having infrastructure on the street and its relationship to the inequitable policing, what do you have comments sort of about how infrastructure and gentrification, especially cycling infrastructure, gentrification go together? We had a couple examples in Portland of sort of projects that didn't go very well because of that intersection between infrastructure and gentrification.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated topic, and it's so contextual too. I think my colleague Lindsay Braun and some of her collaborators have looked at sort of objectively whether there's a link between gentrification and bicycle infrastructure. And in some places there is, and in some places there isn't. The problem fundamentally is how has the community been involved and engaged in the planning process? Has it been the city has come to the community and said, this is our bike plan and your neighborhood is next for bike lanes, and oh, by the way, white, young, middle class folks are moving into your neighborhood too at the same time? Or has there been actual co-planning, co-engagement, real discussions, grassroots planning that have gone into the decisions around infrastructure? And I think, in Chicago, there's examples of both sides. One, the 606, which is similar to the High Line in New York City, where they took an old elevated railway, turned it into a multi-use path, and was not necessarily done in conjunction with communities, is in severely impacted neighborhoods in terms of advanced gentrification, and has negatively impacted youth of color specifically, where there's been more 311 calls, more nuisance calls against youth of color than anyone else. And so they say, well, this is not for me, and this is a white person's thing. On the other side, there's one of your colleagues, Amy Lovato, looked at an example of where planning and community intersected around bicycle infrastructure, and really engaged community around the Paseo Boricua in Chicago that was seen as sort of a boon to the community. So it can go both ways. And again, as I started out saying, I think really the fundamental idea is that planners and communities need to talk to one another and sort of build these things together in order for it to be successful in the faces of these economic pressures.
I am going to throw in one question here just to follow up on some of the data you presented, so we all understand it. The chart showing the odds of getting a ticket based on street infrastructure.
Yes.
At the top, you had arterial streets that had the higher odds. Just to clarify, are those only arterials without bike infrastructure?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, and so they're right on the sidewalk there because there is no bike.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Just wanted to make sure that we all understood that. Chris, do you see a question? There are more.
There, yeah. The font is very small.
Oh, here's a question, maybe similar, related a little bit to the regression analysis. Was the data adjusted in any way for the fact that protected bike infrastructure is more common in the white and affluent neighborhoods?
Well, I controlled for the neighborhood composition of the racial composition of the neighborhood, and adjusted, or the key variable of interest was the type of infrastructure, and that should account for disparities. I also adjusted for the length of the street segment because these were not uniform segment lengths, and so we're looking at a comparison controlling for street length and neighborhood composition. I'm hoping that gets at the question, but the proposer can email me if they want more details about the regression.
I think it does, and I just noticed our time is 12:29 p.m. So I am going to wrap this up. I think I have one announcement, but virtual applause to Dr. Barajas. Thank you so much. A lot of positive feedback from the folks asking questions. So,
Thanks.
and as a reminder, we will be posting the video of this and the slides so you can watch it again and share it with your friends and colleagues. And then I am just want to alert you, sorry, I lost my notes. We have, you can sign up for our future Friday seminars each week and our monthly newsletter as well, and hear more about some of our other research and projects. So with that, we're going to end right on time. And thank you so much for kicking off our Friday seminar for the fall with a very insightful and important presentation. Thanks.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
It's great. Just a quick note for the students, if you're still on, if you have any questions related to the class, feel free to email Professor Dill or I, and we'll respond either on that or in D2L. So thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Barajas.
Thank you. Yep.
Thanks.